Hello, grade 12 students. In this video, we're going to move to a new chapter, chapter 10, Myotatic Reflex, on page 202. Myotatic reflex is the contraction of a muscle in response to its stretching. It's of two kinds, either patellar reflex or the Achillean reflex. Flexion or the extension, mainly it's used for the limbs. So limbs, we use the words flexion or extension. Contraction and relaxation or stretching, these are used for the muscles. So for relaxation or stretching and contraction, they are used for the flexor muscle. It's the muscle whose contraction that causes flexion, while the extensor is the muscle whose contraction can cause extension. As their name indicates, flexor, flexion, extensor, extension. Okay, so these are flexor, flexion, and extensor, we have extension. Let's move to document 1, maintaining posture. So to walk, to balance, to stand up, all are about the postural activities that the human body can perform by reflex while maintaining its equilibrium. How can we illustrate this type of reflex? How is the posture maintained? Let's see. Studies on the myotatic reflex. During a routine medical checkup, the doctor sometimes using a classical test by the help of a small rubber hammer. This is the small rubber hammer shown here. He hits lightly either on the patellar tendon, which is the knee joint, or that moves the leg forward by the patellar reflex, or on the Achillean tendon. This is the Achillean tendon. This Achillean tendon causes an extension of the foot, which is called Achillean reflex. Document A. Hitting on either the patellar tendon that moves the leg forward, it's called patellar reflex, or on the Achillean tendon that called the extension of the foot is called Achillean reflex. Any aberration in the response, weak or strong, is a sign of a perturbation in the nervous system. So clinical observations done on patients after accidents show the structures involved in a myotatic reflex. Here we have degenerations of certain structures found in the muscle, neuromuscular spindles. Any degeneration of these, found in the muscle of the triceps ray makes, this is the triceps ray, okay? Any degeneration of structures found in the muscle, which are the neuromuscular spindles of the triceps ray, makes the Achillean reflex disappear. So any degeneration of the neuromuscular spindles, they make the Achillean reflex disappear, meaning that these neuromuscular spindles, they are involved in the Achillean reflex. Okay. Second, on the contrary, this muscle continues to contract voluntarily and the foot extends and bends. A lesion of the sciatic nerve. So a lesion of the sciatic nerve makes the Achillean reflex disappear. So a lesion of the sciatic nerve makes the Achillean reflex disappear. So sciatic nerve has an important role in the Achillean reflex. A lesion of the spinal cord in the lumbosacral region, from where the sciatic nerve originate, cause the Achillean reflex also disappear. So this means that the spinal cord has an important role in the Achillean reflex. Experimental study. In 1913, Charrington started his study on the effect of muscle stretching on its contraction. He used the experimental setup shown or drawn in document B. What he did? He isolated the spinal cord of a cat from the encephalon by cutting it at the level of medulla oblongata of the spinal animal. He placed the animal on a table and tightly fixed one of the femurs. He then sectioned the lower tendon of the quadriceps muscle, keeping its innervation intact. This tendon was attached to a recording instrument, a myograph, placed above the table. Upon lowering the table, the muscle is stretched to a maximum value of 0.8 centimeter. The recording of the tension developed by the muscle during its stretching is given by document C. So this is the experimental setup of Sherrington experiment. Stretching, we have this cat, stretching of the muscle by lowering the table, sectioning of the spinal cord, and here we have the myograph. Here are the results. So in the absence of stretching, we don't have stretching, the muscle shows slight tension, which is about 0.2 approximately. Slight tension 0.2 kilograms. So this means that there is a presence of a muscular tonicity. What do we call it? Muscular tonicity. So as stretching increases from 0.1 or from 0.1 to 0.8 approximately, 0.8 centimeter. So let's talk this movement, 0.8 centimeter. Tension in the muscle increases from 0.2 to about 2.9 kilograms. So it increases to about 2.9 kilograms. So as I said, as it increases from 0.1 to approximately to 0.9 to 0.8 or 0.9, these values, the tension in the muscle increases from 0.2 to 2.9 kilograms. As stretching is maintained constant for 5 seconds at about 0.8 centimeter. The tension gradually decreases to reach 2.2 kilograms and it will stabilize here. While here we have a stabilization in the stretching. What does this mean? This means that the muscle responds to its own stretching by the process of contraction. So the muscle here responds to its stretching by contraction. So this is what we call it by the myotatic reflex. Moving to paragraph 2, the posterior motor function. The myotatic reflex is the contraction of the muscle. This is the definition here. The myotatic reflex is the contraction of the muscle to its own stretching. It intervenes in maintaining posture. Standing is a balanced position resulting from the contraction of the extensor muscle that opposes the collapse of the body under the effect of the gravity. So neck muscles, extensors of the head. Here we have flexor muscles of the head, abdominal back muscles, extensors, extensor of the legs, flexors of the leg, they make flexion, extensor, they did extension, flexors of the foot, these are the flexors of the foot, they make flexion, extensors of the foot, they make extension. So any modification in the position of the body in space provokes the stretching of extensor muscles and consequently their contraction, thus permitting the readjustment of the body's position and the maintenance of its balance. So number 1, referring to the clinical observation, pick up the elements involved in the Achilles reflex. We said that whenever we have degeneration in the neuromuscular spindles or in the skeletal nerve, or we have lesions in the spinal cord, all of them, they cause the Achilles reflexes appear. What does this indicate? This indicates, or this means that these structures, which are the neuromuscular spindle, the skeletal nerves, and the spinal cord, they are involved in the Achilles reflex. What do the results of triangle experiment show? So in the absence of any stretching, whenever we don't have any stretching, we have the muscle show slight tension, which is about 0.2 kilogram. Here we have what's known by muscular tonicity. While as stretching of the muscle increasing, the stretching of the muscle increases from 0.1 to about 0.8. So as it increases from 0.1 to 0.8, the tension in the muscle increases from 0.2 to about 2.9 approximately to 2.9 kilogram. As stretching is maintained constant for about 5 seconds, it remains a constant. It remains the same at 0.8 centimeter here. So the tension gradually decreases to 2.2 kilograms and it remains constant. What does this mean? This means that, or this indicates that the muscle responds to its own stretching by contraction. This is what we call it by the Achilles reflex. Achilles reflex is a myotatic. Justify, since in this reflex, which is the myotatic reflex, we have the percussion of the Achilles tendon causes the tension of the triceps array, the stretching, sorry, of the triceps array that responds by contraction that leads to this response. This is what we call it a myotatic reflex. Number 4, gravity tends to pull the head down. Explain how the body modifies this effect. As a response to their stretching due to the effect of the gravity, the extensors of the head. What are the extensors of the head? Neck muscles, they are extensors of the head. What do? They contract to correct the position of the head and to maintain equilibrium. They contract and maintain the correct position of the head and maintain the equilibrium. Okay, so these are the answers. So as I said, number 1, after generation of the neuromuscular spindle or the sciatic nerve or after the lesion of the spinal cord, the Achilles reflex disappears. What does this mean? This means that these structures are involved in the Achilles reflex. In these parts, I did interpret. Okay, so neuromuscular spindles, we have the sciatic and the lesion and the spinal cord, all of them, they are involved in the Achilles reflex. In the absence of stretching, the muscle shows slight tension, 0.2 kilogram. This indicates that the presence of the muscular tenacity, we call it muscular tenacity. So as stretching increases, from the value 0.1 to 0.8 centimeter, tension in the muscle increases from 0.2 to 2.9 kilograms. As stretching is maintained constant for 5 seconds at 0.8 centimeter, tension gradually decreases to reach 2.2 kilograms and stabilizes there. This means that the muscle responds to its own stretching by process of contraction. This what do we call it? By myotatic reflex. Number 3. Since in this reflex, the percussion of the Achilles tendon causes the stretching of the triceps array muscle that responds by contraction that leads to this response, extension of the foot. This is what we call it a myotatic reflex. As a response to their stretching due to the effect of the gravity, the extensors of the head, they are here, the neck muscles, they contract. They make contractions to correct the position of the head and to maintain the equilibrium position. Here we have a note that the center of the myotatic reflex, here it's called Achilles reflex, is the spinal cord, since it still exists even in a spinal animal. So pay attention to this note. Myotatic reflex, here this reflex, myotatic reflex, is in the spinal cord, is its center, since it exists even though in a spinal animal. Now let's start with document 2, anatomy of the reflex action, page 206. Document 2 showing anatomy of the reflex action. So reflex is an activity or variation of an involuntary activity of an effector organ. It's provoked by the stimulation of a receptor and needs the interference of a nerve center. In a myotatic reflex, the muscle contracts in response to its stretching. How are the structures involved in this reflex organized? Let's talk about the structure of the spinal cord. Already we talked about the spinal cord, the structure, organization, and its different parts. So let's start step by step. The spinal cord shown in document A, which is a transverse section of the spinal cord, is a nerve center, which is an extension of the encephalon. It's embedded inside the spinal duct of the vertebral column, and it's anatomically related to the organs of the trunk and the limbs by about 31 spinal nerves. Each nerve is connected to this center by 2 roots, a ventral one and a dorsal. In this one, the dorsal, we have something called the ganglion, the spinal ganglion. Here we have the dorsal root, and here we have the spinal ganglion. Here we have the ventral root. Okay. Microscopic observation of a transverse section of the spinal cord in document C, this section, show the gray substance is made up of cell bodies of multipolar neurons having sheathless cytoplasmic prolongations, whereas in the white matter we only observe axon surrounded by myelin sheath. So when we section a neuron, thus separating its cell body from its cytoplasmic extension, the part that contains the nucleus survives, whereas the other part deteriorates. Let's move now to this document. This document is talking about the role of the roots of the spinal nerve by experimental verification. These experiments, they are for Magendie and Bell. They are made on dogs. So this experiments enable us to know the direction of the nervous messages and the roots of the spinal nerves. These are the results of Bell and Magendie experiments. So let's start with the case of the sectioning of the ventral root. We did a sectioning for the ventral root. What happens? Sectioning of the ventral root. In the case of the sectioning of the ventral root, we did stimulation on the peripheral end. So stimulation of the peripheral end, in this case, it leads to the muscle contraction of the region innervated by the nerve. So we have muscle contraction. While when we did stimulation of the central end, we have no response. Stimulation of the central end didn't give any response. So what does this indicate? This indicates that the ventral root carries the nervous message in a centrifugal manner and a centrifugal direction. While in the case of the sectioning of the dorsal root and in the case of stimulation of the central end, we have the feeling of pain. Whereas stimulation of the peripheral end, it shows no response. This indicates that the dorsal root carries the nervous message in a centripetal direction toward the center. The muscle, a receptor, and an effector organ. The skeletal muscle is made up of striated contractile muscle fibers arranged in parallel with each other, where the neuromuscular spindles they are found in document A. Each spindle is formed of specialized muscle fibers, the extrafusal, in which the central parts are not contractile. The extremity of a sensory nerve fiber of large diameters forms a sensory receptor in a spinal form. The extremity of an alpha motor nerve fiber forms a motor plate at the level of the extrafusal muscle fibers. These are the extrafusal muscle fibers. The intrafusal fibers also receive a special motor innervation of type gamma. So the Golgi tendon organs localized in the tendons of the muscles are sensitive to the tension that affects the tendon and hence to that exerted by the muscle. Here we have a structure of the neuromuscular spindle and the motor and the plate. This is the motor and the plate shown here with the help of the intrafusal muscle fibers and the extrafusal. Identification of the role of the neuromuscular spindle. So here, what do they say that the ventral root of the spinal nerve is motor and the dorsal root is sensory, part 2 in Prometa document. Since whenever we have sectioning of the ventral root, it leads to the total loss of the motor activity as shown in the figure, while the sectioning of the dorsal root leads to the total loss of the sensibility for this. It's called, it has a sensory function. So sectioning of the ventral root, it leads to the total loss of the motor activity and we have sensibility or we have sensitivity, while sectioning the dorsal leads to the loss of sensibility and to the maintenance of the motor activity. This means that the dorsal has a sensory function. While let's move to why do they say that the muscle is a receptor and effector organ at the same time in document A? So the muscle contains two types of fibers of two different functions. We have intrafusal muscle fibers. Intrafusal muscle fibers, they are surrounded by sensory nerve fibers forming the neuromuscular spindle. This is what we call it, neuromuscular spindle. This is what we call it, the sensory receptor. The contractile extrafusal muscle fibers, they receive a motor nerve fibers. They have an effector function. So the muscle at the time is a receptor and it's an effector. This is part number 3. Let's move now. Identification of the role of the neuromuscular spindle. An isolated muscle having intact nerve connections with the spinal cord is subjected to modifications in its length. Using an oscilloscope, we record the electric activity of two sensory fibers. Here we have A is at rest, B whenever we have stretching, C whenever we have contracted muscle. So Here we have the case frequency of the action potentials. This is the first one. And here we have frequency of the action potential in a sensory nerve originating from the Golgi tendon. Here, originating from the neuromuscular spindle. So when the muscle is at rest, the frequency of the action potential in the neuromuscular spindle fiber, or the neuromuscular spindle fiber, yes, is weak. This frequency increases in the case of stretching, and it becomes 0 approximately in the case of contraction, whenever we have contraction. Also, the spindle is sensitive to stretching. So here we can deduce that the spindle is sensitive for stretching. In this case, we have higher frequency. Let's move to the case of the Golgi tendon. The Golgi tendon organ doesn't show an action potential. In the case where we have the resting, we have it at rest. So we didn't show any action potential except when the muscle is stretched or it's contracted. And here in the case of resting muscle, there is no action potential. Let's move now. The Golgi tendon is sensitive to stretching and to contraction. This way we can say it's specific for the muscle tension. It's responsible for the muscle tension. This is part 4. Draw out the role of the neuromuscular spindle and the Golgi tendon. So the spindle is sensitive for stretching, while the tendon is specific for muscular tension. Number 5, so draw a schematic. I don't want this. So we have some notes here that extrafusal muscle fibers, they are contractile, they are innervated by the alpha motor fibers. Intrafusal, they are contractile only at the extremities. You have to know the difference between extrafusal and the intrafusal. Okay? So at rest, gamma motor fibers, they maintain a certain level of activity that causes the contraction of the extremities of the intrafusal muscle fibers, which eventually will lead to the stretching of the middle region of the intrafusal fibers. This stretching will be detected by the sensory neuron that carries a message toward, as we said, the central nervous system, which we said an excitatory message through the alpha motor fibers to the extrafusal muscle fibers that will contract. This will the cause of the slight muscular contraction at rest that we told you about it in document 1. It's called muscular tenacity. Proving the documents, so in the case of the sectioning of the ventral root, the stimulation of the peripheral end leads to muscular contraction, while that the stimulation of at the level of the central end doesn't give any response. This indicates that the ventral root carries the nervous message in a centrifugal direction. In the case of sectioning of the dorsal root, the stimulation of the central end induces pain, while the stimulation of the periphery doesn't give any response. This means that the dorsal root carries the nervous message in a centrifugal direction, or this way it's a centripetal direction in the dorsal. So in the dorsal, centripetal, in the ventral, centrifugal. You have to study these: ventral, centrifugal, dorsal, centripetal. Part B, they say you have to analyze the experiments of Bella Magendi to deduce the localization of the cell bodies of the neuron. Since degeneration affects only the non-attached part of the cell body, the experiment of the sectioning indicates the location of the neurons. So the degeneration of the spinal nerve showed that the cell bodies are found beside the spinal nerve, the spinal cord. Degeneration of the anterior root separated from the spinal cord and from a part of the spinal nerve shows the cell bodies of a neuron that form the anterior root are found in the spinal cord. The degeneration of the dorsal root from both sides of the ganglion show that the cell bodies of the neuron that form the dorsal root are located in the spinal ganglion. Let's move now to part 2. Justify that the ventral root of the spinal nerve is motor and the dorsal root is sensory. Since the sectioning of the ventral root leads to the loss of the motor activity and to the maintenance of sensibility, the ventral root has a motor function, while after the sectioning of the dorsal root, we have loss of sensibility while we have maintenance of the motor activity. So by this way, we can know that the dorsal has a sensory function while the motor has a motor function. Number 3, why do we say that the muscle is receptor and effector organ? So the muscle contains 2 types of fibers of different function. Interfusal fiber surrounded by sensory nerve fibers, forming what's known by the neuromuscular spindle, the sensory receptor. The contractile extrafusal muscle fibers receive motor nerve fibers' effector function. So the muscle is at the same time a receptor and an effector organ. Part 4 draw out the role of the neuromuscular spindle and that of the Golgi tendon. So let's move step by step. When the muscle was at rest, the frequency of the action potentials in the neuromuscular spindle fiber is weak. This frequency increases in the case of tension and it becomes 0 in the case of contraction. So the spindle here is sensitive to stretching. Moving to the Golgi tendon, the Golgi tendon organ doesn't show any action potential except when the muscle is stretched or contracted. Either we have stretching or contraction. So at rest, it's not active. There is no frequency of action potential. Hence, the Golgi tendon organ is sensitive to stretching and contraction. As such, it's specific to the muscle tension. Now let's start with document 3, the reflex control on page 209. Reflex control. Activities performed by the body need the intervention of many muscles that function in a coordinated manner. How is this coordination performed? How is it controlled? Activity of the antagonist muscle. Antagonist muscle means that muscle that work opposite to each other. When a muscle contracts, the other one relaxes. We called this in the previous videos. So in reflex activity, as in voluntary one, many muscles are involved. Some contract, other they relax. Thus, they allow the movement of the body. Using this setup shown in document A, we can simultaneously record the activity of both muscles of the leg, the triceps ray and the tibialis anterior. Triceps ray, read as TS, triceps ray, tibialis anterior as TA. Triceps ray, extensor muscle of the leg, and the tibialis anterior is the flexor. So tibialis is the flexor, triceps ray is the extender. Document B showing the electromyography of the triceps ray. This is number 1, triceps ray, and number 2 is tibialis anterior during the movement of the foot. This electromyogram showed that during flexion, muscles contract while during the flexion, muscles contract while tibialis, the triceps ray, which is number 1, it relaxes. And this shows that, to the contrary, during extension, the triceps ray contracts while tibialis anterior relaxes. So this electromyogram showed that during flexion, the muscle contract while the triceps ray relaxes. While the opposite, during extension, triceps ray during extension, it contracts while tibialis anterior, it relaxes. This means that the electric activity of each muscle is opposite to each other. Whenever we have relaxation, here we have relaxation, here we have contraction, and the opposite is true. So we can say that these two muscles, they are antagonistic. Let's now move to the coordination of the muscular activity. During the Achilles reflex, the percussion of the Achilles tendon provokes the stretching of the foot. It makes stretches. This movement is the result of the contraction of the extensor, the muscle, the triceps ray, and the relaxation of its antagonist, the tibialis anterior. This coordination necessitates the intervention of the polysynaptic neuronic pathway. C. So this neural circuit of the two muscles consists either of afferent pathway and efferent one. Afferent pathway, this pathway is a sensory one, pathing originating from the stimulated muscle to the stretch muscle. So this is called the afferent. While efferent, that has a direct relation with the alpha motor fibers, neuron, of the stimulated muscle, which is the monosynaptic circuit, and an indirect relation with the alpha motor of the antagonist and connected to the interneuron. It's called polysynaptic circuit. So the same stimulations, either in part 3, they said draw out the role of the anterior neuron in the Achillian reflex. So the anterior neuron in the Achillian reflex, it has an inhibitory role. Why? Because following the same simulations, the same afferent message produced two different efferent messages. The only difference between the two circuits is the presence of the interneuron that reverses the message received by the antagonist muscle. So it's an inhibitory one. So document E, what can you deduce about this recordings in document E? Let's move now to document E. Negative feedback. The elongation of the muscle provokes its contraction, its shortening. Hence, the response is opposite to the stimulus that caused it in document E. So we call it a negative feedback control. Every skeletal muscle possesses two systems of feedback, one concerning its length with the neuromuscular spindle, the other its tension with the Golgi Tendon organs, as we said in the previous chapter. Both play a role in the protection of the muscle against excessive elongation and extension. So control of the reflex action by the superior centers. Using the setup shown in document E, we corrode the electric activity of the triceps array during Achillian reflex in three situations. The software used permits the superposition on the screen of the recordings obtained in the three experimental situations. The first recording corresponds to a normal Achillian reflex. The other two recordings correspond to two situations during which the person contracts his tibialis anterior voluntarily in a manner more or less intense before hitting his Achilles tendon with the reflex hammer shown in document E. So document E is showing is the electromyograms of the triceps array during voluntary modifications of a myotatic reflex. The yellow one is the non-contracted tibialis anterior, violet slightly contracted one, and the blue it's the highly contracted one. So the electromyogram shows the response. They have the same shape, approximately they have the same shape but different amplitudes. So the amplitude decreases with the increase of the tension or the contraction in the tibialis anterior. It's the largest when with a non-contracted one, as seen the yellow one is the largest one. And the weakest one, and sometimes it's negative in the case with highly contracted tibialis anterior. Highly contracted, it's a negative one in the case of a blue sometimes. Okay? Weak one. This shows that the reflex can be modulated, or we can say it can be inhibited by the intervention of the superior nerve. What the meaning of superior nerve here, we're going superior nerve center, we're talking here about the brain. Okay? So the superior nerve center in brain can control the reflex arcs. So now let's move to part 5, explanation of the role of the alpha motor neuron of triceps array during Achillian reflex in each of the situations studied in document E. So in the case when the SNC, when the superior nerve centers doesn't interfere, tibialis anterior not contracted, we don't have contraction of the tibialis anterior, the alpha motor fibers of the extensor muscles receive only excitatory message, EPSP, excitatory postsynaptic potential, from the efferent neuron of the same muscle. This will create an action potential in the axon. This will create an action potential and cause the contraction of the muscle, yielding in the extension of the foot. Yet, when tibialis anterior is slightly contracted, alpha motor receives two nerve messages, one excitatory arriving from the efferent, other one is inhibitory. So, inhibitory one is arriving from the SNC polysynaptic circuit. The alpha motor neuron integrates these messages, performs an algebraic summation. As the excitatory message is more important than inhibitory, this will generate an action potential of lower amplitude that leads in a slight contraction of the triceps array muscle. When the triceps tibialis anterior is highly contracted, like in the case of the blue one, the alpha motor nerve fibers, they receive two nerve messages, one excitatory EPSP and the second one is inhibitory IPSP. So as the inhibitory message is more important than the excitatory, this does not generate an action potential and the muscle does not contract, and here we don't have the extension of the foot. So its role is inhibitory. The electromyogram in part 4, they said, what can you deduce? Recording from document A, the electromyogram shows responses of about the same shape, but they have different amplitude. The amplitude of the response decreases with the increase in the tension or the increase in the contraction in the contracted tibialis anterior. It's the largest with non-contracted tibialis anterior, and the weakest, even negative, with the highly contracted tibialis anterior. This shows that the reflex can be modulated or it can be inhibited when by the intervention of the superior nerve center as SNC, the brain. Therefore, the SNC can control the reflex. Part 5, in the case when the SNC doesn't interfere, tibialis anterior not contracted, the alpha motor fibers of extensor muscle receive only excitatory messages, EPSP, excitatory post-synaptic potential, from the efferent neuron of the same muscle. This will create an action potential in the axon of the alpha motor neuron, causing the contraction of the muscle, yielding in the extension of the foot. Yet, when tibialis anterior is slightly contracted, alpha motor fibers receive two nerve messages, one excitatory arriving from the efferent, another one inhibitory arriving from the SNC polysynaptic circuit. The alpha motor neuron integrates these messages and performs an algebraic summation. As the excitatory message is more important than inhibitory, this will generate an action potential which there's lower amplitude that leads that in a slight contraction of the triceps array muscle extension of the foot. On the other hand, as the tibialis anterior is highly contracted, alpha motor fibers receive two nerve messages. One of them is excitatory EPSP arriving from efferent neuron. Another one is inhibitory arriving from the SNC polysynaptic neuron. So always, as you see, SNC has an inhibitory message. So as the inhibitory message is more important than the excitatory, this does not generate an action potential and the muscle does not contract, and here we have no extension of the foot. Okay guys, thank you for watching this video. See you soon.